Hello and welcome. This is Gary Howarth from PSCR, and we are pleased to present a little bit of information about the Temporal Map Challenge from NIST PSCR. Specifically, today we are going to be covering details about a better meter stick for differential privacy, the metric contest for the Differential Privacy Temporal Map Challenge. Today, I will be presenting a little bit of background of PSCR's work in this area, and then I'll be turning this over to Christine Task, who will be providing us an overview of the challenge and an idea of how to participate. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. PSCR is one of the divisions under NIST within the Communication Technology Laboratory, and PSCR is the primary federal laboratory that conducts research in public safety communications technology. PSCR has 5 key research areas, and then it has 2 cross-cutting research areas. This particular program fits within our public safety analytics portfolio and, of course, is directly related to security for public safety. PSCR conceived this series of prize challenges in collaboration with public safety officials. Public safety identified that they have a great deal of data available that they would like to be able to share. However, we must balance data privacy along with data utility. So these series of challenges hopes to develop new methods of de-identifying data while still maintaining data utility. Specifically, public safety agencies are data generators. Responses to calls, public safety information, data about individual first responders and their movements. There are millions of records that are collected every single day. And we know from a general privacy standpoint that just 3 quasi-identifiers from an anonymized data set can be used to relink individuals back to the original data. Differential privacy is a set of methods that can guarantee that the data released is private and that the data cannot be relinked back to the original sources and the original records. However, differential privacy does not make assurances about the quality of data outputs, and that is what we are trying to assess in this competition.
This is Alicia. She's the Chief Data Officer for her state, and she's excited about the prospects of improving people's lives using big data. But she's also wary of the possibility of malicious actors combining anonymized data with third-party data to re-identify individuals and expose their private information. After all, it's Alicia's responsibility to protect the data of citizens like Bruno here, whose isolated location might make him too easy to identify. To do that, she's using differential privacy to protect this data on elderly citizens. Simply put, differential privacy is a standard that protects privacy no matter what third-party data is available. It does so by strictly limiting what it's possible to learn about any individual in the dataset. Let's see how this works. Alicia wants to share this data with outside consultants who are drafting evacuation plans for the region. To evacuate the elderly, they'll have to estimate the number of buses needed and where they should go. But first, she must privatize the data. Instead of operating on individual information the way anonymization does, differential privacy operates on the entire dataset. This prevents re-identification attacks. It starts with building a model of the data. Alicia creates a grid-based model by aggregating data points by location. Then she adds some randomized noise to the dataset. This changes the values in the dataset by a small random amount. That blurs out the individual records of people like Bruno without affecting the large-scale patterns. It keeps him and everyone else individually unidentifiable. The degree of noise added affects both how well individuals' data is protected as well as how useful the dataset is. Add too much noise and the model won't be useful anymore because it will no longer represent the underlying data accurately. For Alicia, that means bad evacuation plans. One way to increase utility while preserving privacy is to improve the underlying model. By switching to a neighborhood-based model, Alicia has grouped the data points in a way that's more meaningful. She's protected the privacy of residents while building a useful model that clearly shows where buses are needed. In short, differential privacy ensures that including an individual in a dataset does not significantly increase their privacy risk. When models and tools are well designed with differential privacy in mind, they provide a good trade-off between privacy and utility. To see this in action and explore the algorithms and data behind this tutorial, check out the Nexus Research website at nexusresearch.com.
I'm pleased to introduce Christine Task, a senior researcher at Nexus Research and the technical lead for the PSCR differential privacy challenges.
Hello. All right. So as Gary foreshadowed, right, the trick with engineering a good differential privacy tool is that it needs to continue to provide good utility as privacy increases. As you naturally would assume, the more privacy we're providing, eventually if we provide perfect data or perfect privacy and we've completely obliterated all of the original data, the utility drops down to zero. So here's sort of a trade-off, right? We can see as privacy decreases, we provide no privacy at all, the utility becomes perfect, but that's also a problem. And so the competition on the algorithm side is we're asking participants to engineer solutions for the temporal map data problem that provide a good trade-off, that have those curves in a good position where they're continuing to provide good utility at the point that they're providing good privacy. I say that, and we have a relatively simple way of determining how much privacy they're providing, at least a good metric for that, which is the value of epsilon in differential privacy. That's the privacy parameter on the dial that you would have seen in the tutorial video. But when it comes to utility, that is in some sense still an open question. And we are reaching out to you to help us answer it. So, next slide. That brings us to this. The metrics that we ask you to develop, you submit for this competition, are going to be considered when we are developing the metrics to evaluate the privacy competitors on in the third sprint. So things you come up with, you'll actually get to see potentially how well the competitors do on them, how well they are satisfying your definition of utility. What we are looking for this is metrics that measure the quality. This is a temporal map challenge, we'll get more into that, but we want them to measure quality with respect to geographic accuracy or temporal accuracy, or both. They need to be able to work not just in a single data set, but in a wide variety of contexts, because these metrics, it's good to have them for the challenge, but NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, is a metrology lab. And so the goal here is to collect a good set of metrics that can be used to evaluate this, both for the challenge and for contexts outside of the challenge. In order for them to function for that, they need to be clearly explained, well understood, and straightforward to correctly implement and use. So they need to be written up very clearly. And that's what we're going to describe a bit for the rest of this talk. So next slide. Okay, so challenge timeline. What is going on overall here? Right now, as sort of straightforward, we are in the period you have until January 5th to think of a metric, to write it up and submit it. There'll be a couple days of evaluation. We're going to do some basic filtering on those, and then solutions will be presented for public voting. And the public will have a chance to read through your executive summaries, read through your whole write-up, and decide which metrics look good to them. We're also going to have subject matter expert judging internally, and then winners will be announced in early February. And we will go and take some of those, and like I said, use them as we're developing the metrics for evaluating the third sprint, the final sprint of the algorithms contest. All right, next slide. Okay, prizes, very important, right? Prize purse of up to $29,000 for this challenge. We're going to be offering prizes in 3 tiers, up to 2 winners of $5,000, $3,000, $2,000, and $1,000. This gives us the possibility of offering a lot of prizes. So please, we want to see what you have to say. If you have a small idea, a brilliant idea, if you have only a week to work on it, we want to see what you have to say. Because what we're really looking to do is collect a really good suite of these evaluation metrics. And so we want everybody to have a voice. So there's a lot of possible awards. And also, as we said, public voting, there's a People's Choice Award too. All right, next slide. Okay, timeline. So I had glossed over this, but right now, all of the information is up on the website that you need to be able to prepare a submission, all of the rules, data sets, everything like that, and we'll go over that. There is, the big deadline is January 5th, but there's an intermediate deadline. On November 30th, if you submit your executive summary, and there's just a little 2-page summary that says basically what your metric is, what's the idea behind it, and it gives a real-world use case. If you submit that by November 30th, we'll give you feedback on it. So just a few high bullet points, what we think looks neat, questions and curiosities we have about it, and we'll get that back to you while you've still got sort of plenty of time to take that into account in your analysis. Also, immediately after the executive summary review, we're going to have another webinar, and we'll be able to provide sort of more insight, things like what you're about to see here, but with respect to what we're seeing from general submissions and things like that. Okay, next slide. All right, what are we asking you to submit? So I said the goal is to make sure that we have something that is clear and well-defined and something that can really see use, not just for this challenge, but in the world as a whole. And so that these are things that we are keeping in consideration. We're judging you on your clarity. If you've done a good job of explaining your technical background, if you've answered questions, things like this. We are judging you on your utility, how useful the metric is. So it should, cover breadth of use cases. It should do a good job of distinguishing between the real and the privatized data. It should be sort of generalizable and robustness. Does it work on large volume use cases? Does it have good parameters? And have you, thought about what those parameters do? And can it be used in other use cases besides the specific one we've got for the challenge? And so what we're asking you to write up is the sort of the summary here. This is an executive summary, just a 1-2 page, easy readable summary of the main ideas. And that's important because both for public voting and for possible later uses, this is sort of the cover letter on your metric. This gives you everybody who's looking at it just a quick sense of what it is and gets them interested if they want to learn more. And if they are interested and they want to learn more, then we provide them with more, right? So we ask you to provide a good, clear technical definition of your metric, including any backgrounds. So we want to make sure that this is going to be accessible to the people who would want to use it. And some of those people may be in social science, they may be in computer science, they may have a background in statistics, they may have more of a background in discrete math. And so the goal here is to anything that is a technical background that needs to be understood in order to really grok how the metric operates. We want you to cover that. Explain about sort of parameters and configurations, walk through the metric use. We'll go over more what that means. And then once you've sort of clearly explained what the metric is, go further and analyze how it works, right? So the metric defense. We want to know about how those parameters affect how the metric operates. We want to know how well it distinguishes between the real and the privatized data. How well it covers breadth of use cases. How is it feasible? Does it sort of choke and die if we try and run on too large of a data set or too large of a data schema? and then go ahead and show us how it can apply in multiple sort of different applications or contexts. And in this, essentially, you're giving it to us and we're judging on it, and we're inviting the public to judge on it. But you want to think about this as something that you're writing up for people who will actually use this metric in privacy research and help them understand your perspective and how it's going to operate and things like that. Okay, yeah, next slide. Okay, so let's go a little bit over the website. If you go to HeroX, and we're going to cover the resources that are available when you do this. So go ahead, next slide. So you'll see up at the top of the HeroX website for the challenge, there's a little bar. On the far right, it says resources. If you click on that, we got resources. So these are the things we're going to provide you to help you produce that write-up and further define and analyze your metrics. So the first one is data sets, because analyze on what, right? So this includes a brief sort of, this includes a couple different data sets. One that is the one we're using in sprint 1 of the algorithms challenge, and the other one is more demographic data. They're both temporal map data sets. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. Next slide. There is also an example write-up. So we've gone ahead and for the metric that we're using in the first sprint of the algorithms challenge, we have written up a submission analysis on that metric, and you can go look through it as what an example submission might look like. Next slide. Submission template. So this has just the set of sections that you need to have in your submission. And next slide. Go back one. There we go. So note the fact that there's a template provided. It just goes through, like I just showed previously, the various sections we want you to have. But the template is optional. You don't have to use exactly that Word file. It's totally fine if you want to do this in LaTeX or whatever else is convenient for you. Just make sure that you include all of the sections that are listed there. Okay, next slide. Okay, and one other resource that you may look at is if you go over to the Driven Data website for the algorithms challenge, and you go to the data download section, there is a competitors pack. You scroll down the page a bit, and the competitors pack is all of the resources that we're providing the competitors on the algorithm side. You may need to register for the challenge to access that, but that's straightforward to do. And those have some neat things. So you can actually get at the baseline implementation that privatizes the data. So we provided you with several data sets that have already been privatized, but you can go ahead and privatize your own at different values of epsilon. You can look through the write-up for the privatizer if you're curious. There's also the pie chart metric. You can actually run the pie chart metric if you're curious about it. And there's a visualization script that will take privatized data and show you on a map of Baltimore how well or poorly you're doing. And so that is also interesting. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about that data. We said we were providing data. So there are two data sets that we're going to give you. And these are data sets that once you come up with a metric, you want to know how that metric behaves, right? Well, the metric's being used to score data. We've given you some data to score. That includes the ground truth data and then 3 further data sets that have been privatized at different levels of quality. So there's a very poor data set and a mediocre data set, an okay data set. For the 911 Baltimore incident data here, the data contains, the data will always have time and map segments. So here, the time actually goes all the way down to hour and minute. The map segment is neighborhoods. I think there are about 250 neighborhoods in Baltimore, and you can see them on the map on the left there. And then incident type. And so incident type is a number that indicates there's about 200 different possible codes, and that is things like homicide, traffic accident, elopement is one of them. So this is the nature of the 911 call. And then there's a simulated resident ID that's mostly used in the algorithms challenge. You don't need to worry about that, although you can if you want to. That resident ID identifies persons. So we have generated artificial persons for this data, and one person may be responsible for multiple records, multiple 911 calls. And to find out all of the records associated with that one person. You take a look at their number over there, 61105, look up all the records that have that number. Those are all the events associated with that person. So this is one data set to play with. Come up with a metric. You run your metric on the ground truth and various privatized versions and see how it comes out. And you learn a little bit more about how your metric works. Next slide. Okay, the second data set. So all that had, right, the payload of that was only the event type. We had the time unit, the space unit, and then just an event type. But a lot of things that are interesting about data sort of require more interesting information than that. So we have also included an excerpt from the American Community Survey data from Maryland. And here we've taken 8 years of data. And so the time segment is year. The map segment is PUMA. PUMA is public use microdata area. And so those are, there's a few dozen of them in Maryland as a whole. The ones for Baltimore are shown in the image to your left there. And then it actually has some interesting payload information in the records. So we have demographic variables such as age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and education. We have financial data variables such as wage, income earned, total income, and poverty level. And then we have some other information, arrival and departure from work time. And these are great big variables that tell within 10 minutes when you arrive or depart from work. And they're very interesting to test behaviors of metrics because they give you a large set of data ranges to work with. Interestingly distributed data. Okay, so next slide. But note, you are not required to use either of the probability or provided example data sets. You can come up with your own data set. You can find one online. You can create it yourself. You can generate it, especially as you may want to do this as you're examining interesting, tricky edge cases for how your metric behaves. You don't even have to involve Maryland. Regardless of NIST is in Maryland, we'll let you go someplace else. So just to note that. Okay, next slide. All right, so thinking about this problem, the temporal map data problem is fundamentally a problem of counts of record types spread across space and time, right? So when you're going to look for that other data set, what you're looking for is something that has timestamps and map segments. And what you're looking to evaluate on is how well it maintains the distribution of that data across time and across the map segments, right? This is the animated maps. This is epidemiology. This is advertising. It's all variety of things where we're analyzing how data changes across a geography and over a period of time. This is a tricky problem for privacy because as data gets, one person's data creates a footprint not just once, but scattered across time. That footprint becomes much larger and much more potentially uniquely identifiable. And that makes it tricky for the privacy side of this problem. It's tricky on the, it is tricky on the metrics side though, because you're looking at not just one picture of a map, but it's essentially a sequence of map pictures. And getting your head fully grokked around how your metric is behaving, both with respect to geography and with different record types and across the schema and across time, can be a little bit interesting. Okay, so next slide. Let's give you a nice trivial baseline example of a metric. So this is the pie chart metric, and this is the one that we are using for scoring in sprint 1 of the algorithms challenge. And the pie chart metric is sort of a nice simple one. And it solves that problem of space and time by ignoring both of them. It operates only in one neighborhood at one point in time. And then once it's scored that neighborhood in that point in time, it scores all the remainder neighborhoods and points in time, and then averages across the whole space to get a final score. So this is very simple, and we expect you guys to be able to improve on it. And I hope as I'm explaining it, you're thinking of potential flaws. Next slide. So the way the pie chart metric works is what it's aiming to do is identify the most important signals in the data, the most significant signals in the data. So it starts by a thresholding. It cuts out any record types any event types that occur less than K%. So elopement is not a very common 911 call. It tends to get thresholded out. And you're left with only sort of the most significant counts, the thickest, or not the thickest, but the sufficiently thick pie chart slices. And you're going to compare the pie chart slices that the ground truth pie chart has versus the privatized pie chart. You do that using, we use Jensen-Shannon distance. Next slide. Jargon alert, Jensen-Shannon distance. All right, so in our algorithms write-up for this metric, sorry, in our metric write-up for this, in our technical background section, this is the only bit of anything technical beyond sort of high school, early undergrad content that we use. And so we give a good explanation of it. Jensen-Shannon is related to KL divergence, which you may be more familiar with, but it's symmetric. The property that gets us is that when the ground truth is 0, but the privatized data is not, it does not crash and explode. KL divergence is not meant to operate that. KL divergence is not symmetric, but Jensen-Shannon distance is. And so this gives us that sense of distribution distance that we need. And in addition to this excerpt here, there's more resources that we've linked in our metrics write-up for anybody who wants a more detailed explanation of how this works. Okay, next slide. Okay, Jensen-Shannon distance tells us how we managed to keep the width of the pie slices fairly similar between the ground truth and the privatized data. But we want to do better than that, right? Because you'll note that in the ground truth data, we have 2 pie slices, one for W and one for Z. And the privatized data, we've kept the slice of W pretty similar to what it was in the ground truth, but we've introduced an entirely new data slice, X. We made it seem super frequent, and this can happen because in differential privacy, when you go to add privatization noise, sometimes it's possible to take a record type or a count that is very small in the ground truth, but when you add some random values to it, it becomes very large in the privatized data. And this is something that we want to, differentially private algorithms that have a problem with this, we want to penalize them. So our first additional penalty on top of the Jensen-Shannon distance, and this is, again, thinking very clearly about the real-world utility of these pie charts and what can cause problems for actual use cases. Well, if I'm trying to use a privatized pie chart and it says X is super frequent in some neighborhood where it's not, say X is elopement, everybody's eloping all of a sudden in Southeast Baltimore, that data is much less useful than it was before. So misleading presence penalty. Anytime they do that for any slice that they have appear as frequent in the privatized data that was not in the ground truth data, we give them a significant penalty. We basically drop them a letter grade. Next slide. Something else we have been ignoring here is the number of events. So I said that sometimes with the privatization, you can end up adding, events that weren't there, right? You can end up adding to counts. When you do that, this makes sense, first of all. So this is okay in general. If my counts matched exactly in my privatized data to my ground truth data, then my privatized data would match my ground truth data. I would not be providing any privacy. You're supposed to blur, essentially, as you're moving to the privatized data. But you can't let that get out of control. And if my privatized algorithm is adding large amounts of noisy counts and greatly inflating the counts, again, I have a sleepy little neighborhood in North Baltimore, and all of a sudden it seems like it's the most active place in the world. They're calling 911 for, elopement, cat up the tree, mass homicide every day, and that's a problem. So we have a bias penalty too, positive bias penalty or negative. If your count of events in a neighborhood varies too significantly from the ground truth count, we also penalize it. We penalize it very sharply. Next slide. And like I said, in order to get a score for the whole map time area, you have to average, we average all of this together. We just take a simple average. Okay, next slide. So I said there were flaws in this, and I hope you're thinking about some of them. Flaws and blind spots and so on. It's a perfectly good metric, first of all metrics will have blind spots. And this is simply because you're taking something very complex, large data in space and time, possibly over many features, And you're collapsing it down into something very small, a number. It says, hey, you did great, you've got an 870. As soon as you do that, there's going to be things, it's a many to one relationship, you're going to have blind spots. So understanding, this is the main thing that we are asking of you in your submissions, is to understand and clearly explain where the limitations of your approach are. So here's some limitations. The pie chart metric does not measure the impact of privatization noise on patterns in less frequent record types, right? We do that thresholding. So we're only looking at more frequent ones. It doesn't capture the relative ranking of high frequency record types. So we're just doing Yints and Shannon. That may mean that, neighborhood A has its top thing is traffic accidents, and its next thing is poor parking or something. And we flip those two into privatized, so the ranking comes out different. We're not checking rankings here. Yints and Shannon doesn't do that for us, so we'll miss that. We don't do anything measuring trends across time, right? So we're just doing a great big average. And that means that we can't distinguish between small variations in all of our neighborhood year chunks or a few big variations and then a lot of really small variations, right? So average definitely takes a lot of interesting information and kind of squishes it all out into just that little number, and that means we're going to be missing some things. Also, this focuses on record types, so categorical information. This is not doing anything. If we want to do numerical data, like income or poverty, things like this, we would need to partition it into bins, ranges. And again, you can lose information that way. So we do have blind spots that we know about when we're just getting these sort of pie chart snapshots. Next slide. And it's probably not all the blind spots, but that's the ones that are on this slide. Cool, coverage. Okay, so what are our limitations to coverage? What are tasks that we are not, that we do not represent? So the pie chart doesn't do anything with complex analytics or machine learning tasks. It's not doing regression or classification. All of those may have different sensitivities to added noise. It doesn't cover anything that studies larger patterns in trends or across geography or time. So it's oblivious to anything like that. It just focuses on categorical information and doesn't look at all sorts of interesting things that exist out there dealing with numerical data and so on. So there's lots of room to do more interesting metrics besides this pie chart. Pie chart's great, but when people are performing well in sprint 1 of the algorithms challenge, we only know how well they're doing with respect to some things. There's lots of other things that we don't know. Next slide. As long as we're at it, though, we will talk about scalability. The pie chart metrics, super simple to compute, scales beautifully, runs in seconds on large data sets, and then actually less than seconds probably, and then generalizability. So this is where we say, okay, in our experiments, we have done this on event data. How would you apply it to something besides event data? So we can apply it to demographic data, financial data, and so on. By using marginals, by essentially binning numerical features. So we're going to say, rather than doing a pie chart of event types, we could do a pie chart of education by income, right? So we have slices for possible combinations of educational attainment, college, let's say undergraduate or high school, undergraduate, graduate degree, and then income, but we wouldn't be able to do all possible income values. We would need to bin it. So we would say incomes between, 0 and 30K, 30 and 60K. And that way we could have a reasonable number of possible pie slice labels. If we have a pie slice label for every possible income, down to the dollar amount, then all of a sudden, that's too many pie slices. They're all going to be skinny. The algorithm won't work. We can do the same thing with time, right? We could use, instead of event labels, we can have counts of things that happen between timestamp 1 and timestamp 2. So you can think creatively about how your metric might work or be adapted to different contexts than the one you originally considered. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the really interesting bit. So we provided you data sets, but up until this point, I have only vaguely hand-waved about what you might want to do with those data sets to evaluate your metric. So there is a significant section of the write-up that asks for an analysis of tuning properties, essentially how your metric behaves depending on the properties of the input data and the properties of the parameters in your metric. So obviously, the most interesting parameter for the pie chart metric is the frequency threshold. This is the point at which we slice off and we say, if you are less frequent than this, if you are too skinny of a pie slice, we're going to ignore you. And here we see that if we have a frequency threshold of 5%, which is the one that we had decided to use in the challenge, and then scale here on the left, that's going from good quality data down to very poor quality data. And so you can see that the scores from the good quality data so are showing up about 0.6 on the that frequency threshold that we decided to go with, 0.05, and then they descend rapidly, right? So we're doing a mid-level quality on good quality data, and then from 10 and 20, our score drops down precipitously. And so this is good. This just shows that we are at this threshold doing a good job of distinguishing between the real and the privatized data. What happens if we set the threshold too narrow, so down to we allow very small pie slices, is that our range of outputs actually collapses, because now we've made the problem of preserving that pie chart much harder. And so at lower qualities of data, the score is almost not distinguishable, right? We can't very well distinguish between 10 and 20 because the score is just terrible. Meanwhile, if we go up to 10%, now we allow higher quality, now we allow higher scores, and we're still getting somewhat of a decent range, although, again, it's a little bit truncated between the poor and the terrible data. But now we also have to think about our pie chart slices. We're cutting off anything that is less than 10%. That's not as much utility that we're preserving, right? We're not covering as many use cases. In the real world, often they allow pie slices down to 5%. And so that's how we ended up with what we did. But here you have a sense of how the thing behaves. Rather than guessing, rather than just having a magic number, we've gone ahead and explored. Okay, next slide. Yeah, good. Okay, something else we wanted to look at. So we have our baseline score, which is the Yinson-Shannon, and then we have those two penalties. So as we move from good quality data to terrible quality data, how do those two penalties play a role? What portion of the total score are they making up? And here we see that on the left-hand side with very good quality data, that most of the score is coming from Yinson-Shannon, a little bit from misleading presence, and basically nothing from bias. But as we move across and we get worse and worse quality data, we see more and more of the score is being made up by that misleading presence penalty, and more is being made up by the bias. Okay, next slide. All right, something else that you want to do. So we're providing you privatized data, and that gives you the opportunity to look at how things work at various levels of privatization. But it's also good to check against sampling error, because that is another source of error or difference between data sets. And in general, we don't expect privatization to produce higher quality data than when you would get, we want it to be comparable to sampling error. So something you can do is take two subsamples of the data. On the left here, we have an example of 75% subsamples. On the right, we're looking at 50% subsamples. And feed them into your metric, pretending that one of that subsamples is ground truth and the other one is the privatized data, and see how it scores. And that will give you a sense of how the privatized data is comparing to sampling error. In general, if we have only a small amount of sampling error, so this is important. If you have only a small amount of sampling error, so 75% is not subsamples, is not an unreasonable amount of sampling error. And even just with that, you're getting a very low score out of your metric on some sections of the data. And what that means is that those sections of the data for your metric are very hard to do well on. So up here in Baltimore, you'll see there's sort of dark blue neighborhoods right around the outskirts. These are more sparsely populated. They have very few calls in the 911 data. And so that means that they're very difficult to privatize with high utility. It also means that any sort of analysis you want to do on it will be very much impacted by sampling error, which means in general that data is less reliable for use, regardless of whether it's privatized or not. Okay, next slide. Further questions? All right, I won't go through this in too much detail. This is in the write-up and you should take a look at it. But those analyses are what we got done by the deadline. And the submission is a reasonable quality submission, but there's a lot more questions you could ask. There's a lot more edge cases you could look at. There's a lot more interesting things you could poke to make things, really usable, really well understood. So you can look at the algorithms right up if you want to read this in more detail, but next slide. We will look at it a little bit more detail ourselves in general. Okay, so the overall objective of this challenge is to collect metrics that capture the real world use cases, are well defined and well understood. Next slide. And this is what I was talking about. This is for real. We actually want to share this, with your consent, with the privacy research community that is rapidly developing tools being used by the US government, being put into open source libraries. This is a quickly developing area, and we want to make your metrics available to this research area. That means your idea is going to, once you have it written up, it's going to go into other people's hands. It'll be passed around, it'll be pointed out on napkins or beers at conferences, it'll be mentioned briefly in a couple slides in an undergrad lecture, cited in papers, and at some point it's going to get misused, right? So this is defensive driving for metric developers. We want you to be able to do write-ups that are going to reduce the possibility that your metric is going to be misinterpreted, used where it shouldn't apply, that people will draw wrong assumptions from it. And so now we'll give you some tips and tricks about that. Next slide. So first one, think about time versus space. Adventures in space-time. So we are looking at, in this challenge, patterns both across map segments and across time. You want to think, what part of this problem are you tackling? Are you focused only on map segments and simply averaging across time? Or are you looking at trends through time using tools that are developed for that and just averaging across map segments? Or are you handling both? So this is something to consider and to state clearly in your write-up, is how you're approaching space and time. I'll say we're going to go through these a little bit efficiently here, but these slides are also going to be available online, and you'll be able to read through this copious wisdom at leisure. All right, next slide. Data comes in two basic types. So I alluded to this a bit earlier, but basically data comes, features are either ordinal or categorical. Ordinal means they have a natural order to them. So that means a feature like income. You can say that if my income is $20,000 a year, that is less than if my income is $75,000 a year, right? Ages, if I'm 12 years old, that is less than if I'm 22 years old. Percentages, if I have 15%, that's less than 200%. Years, 1972 is less than 2036. Second grade is less than college. So ordinals have a natural ordering to them. Categorical variables don't have that. So these are things often like demographic variables, male, female, other, race, language, ancestry, favorite websites. All of our 911 data is categorical. Map segments are sort of categorical, but of course map segments do have associations with each other in two-dimensional space. Some neighborhoods are next to some other neighborhoods. That gets messy, but often they're treated as categoricals. So how does your metric use these two types of variables? Does it only work with numerical, ordinal data? Does it only work with categorical data? That's fine, or does it use both? But just be clear about how they're used. And here's an example of a marginal metric that we used at the previous NIST Differential Privacy Challenge. And you can look up the information on that online. But they had to use binning ranges for, had to use ranges for income and then categorical variables it could take us. So I had to use binning in order to be able to treat numerical variables as though they were categorical variables. Next slide. About that, right? So when you're thinking about ordinal versus categorical error, ordinals have a nice, easy definition of error, how far apart two variables are. You know, you are in 7th grade, but I said you were in 12th grade, I was off by 5 grades. Categoricals don't have that, right? So you are, you like Facebook, and I said you like Snapchat, but what is the distance there, right? So that becomes more tricky. You can talk about sort of counting up the number of categorical things you've gotten different in a record. You can do things like this to determine error. Counts of number of records with each value, which is what the pie chart metric does. It counts up how many records have each event type, and then it compares those counts between the real and the privatized data. Lots of things you can do. You can even use them in categoricals as predicted values and classification techniques and so on. But note that a lot of data is going to have both ordinal and categorical information, and understanding and thinking clearly about how you're responding to both of them, or either one, if you're only operating over one. But if you're operating over both, what are the constraints and interrelationships between those two things? Okay, next slide. Okay, do you have a great specific real world use case in mind? So for instance, anti-gerrymandering analytics or income inequality, but it's highly dependent. It only runs on a few features in the data. And so it's only applicable to data that has those features. So you're only thinking about, you have to have an income variable if you want to do income inequality, or income and some demographics. Something to do to get from a specific use case to a metric that has more generalizable applicability is to check and see, does it have to only run on that value? So you're checking income inequality because that's a thing we do, economics. But what happens if you do that same sort of check on the poverty level, on wage, on any other numerical variable? You're still checking for structural difference in the data that may have occurred because of privatization. And so this sort of specific use case that you have in mind can be generalized a bit more often. When you do that, you want to be able to say in your write-up for your in your metric write-up, say, okay, this parameter in my metric can take any demographic variable or any combination of demographic variables, and this parameter can take any numerical variable. And that way you get from one use case to a more general thing. And this is, for example, the Gini coefficient was one of the analytics we used in the last match of the last differential privacy challenge. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. If you have a great idea for a comprehensive metric to evaluate the data, but it takes too long to run and it tends to choke and die if there's too many features or too many records, consider randomization. So you can randomly subsample records or features. You're not using every possible record, every possible feature, and get yourself a metric that gets you still a good, high quality, high level snapshot of the data and data quality without exhaustively checking every possible combination. So this is a neat trick, and we use this in the 3 marginal technique that we used in the last challenge. If you're going to do this, though, make sure that you check out different sampling ratios. Are you taking a 10% sample, a 5% sample, and make sure that whatever sample ratio you're doing, it gets you a nice stable performance so that you don't run it many times and get wide differences in your answers. All right, next slide. Snapshot versus deep dive. So often metrics that are designed to give a single total data quality score, so that one number that can be unrolled and expanded a bit to be able to give lots more detailed information about the sources of disparity in the privatized data. So a couple of the tools that we provide in that competitors pack that I showed over on Driven Data is the visualizer. And here the visualizer is showing, it's just doing that pie chart metric, but what it's doing is it's showing with a heat map here which neighborhoods, the blue ones, are performing poorly on the pie chart and which neighborhoods, the gold ones, are performing well on the pie chart. And that lets us say, oh, hey, looking at this, I can see that in these low population areas on the outskirts, I'm performing very poorly. What can I do to improve that? Okay, next slide. Temporal charts. So this is something else that we provide. In that same visualizer, if you check on a neighborhood, you can go ahead and see performance across all of the months. And again, that's letting us nail down for not just a neighborhood now, but over time, how are we performing? Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, checking blind spots. So like I've said a couple times before, and I'll say one more time, all reasonable metrics provide imperfect discriminative power, and that's fine. But we want to be able to say where the blind spots are, right? So anytime we use binning or threshold cutoffs, like in the pie chart metric, those are decision boundaries that create blind spots. We're not seeing what's going on with things inside the bin or things below our threshold. When we're taking a big average or finding a percentile or fitting a curve, we're glossing over some amount of information. So here is a regression on age versus education. This comes from the demographics data set we gave you. And what this sees naturally, right, is that there is a strong correlation between education and age, right? You're unlikely to be in second grade at age 40. But that strong correlation makes sure that that regression is giving us basically the same response, even as the data quality itself becomes very, very poor, right? So it's a coefficient of 0.077 on the ground truth, and it's only 0.079 on the very poor data, and it's very poor data. You can see that it's because of what we've done with the synthesizer here. You can see instead of having this nice gentle curve, it's got these sort of stiff lines. It's going to give you very different evaluation results for many of the evaluations, but it performs the same on regression, and that's because regression has some blind spots. And so trying out your data on, trying out your metric on different types of data, density, sparsity, things like this, and just identifying these blind spots is a good idea. It doesn't mean it's a bad metric because it has them. We just want to know where they are. Next slide. Checking edge cases. Where does your metric do weird stuff? So just like I said, we had to use Yinson-Shannon instead of KL divergence because KL divergence performs badly if the ground truth has a 0 and the privatized data has a non-zero value. You want to think through carefully all the components of your metric and understand where is it going to, what are your underlying assumptions on what data is valid for it to run on? Now, looking at ordinal versus categorical, what if the schema has only one numerical feature or only one categorical feature? What assumptions are you making about the distribution of the data and the shape of the schema for your metric to behave properly? All right, next slide. Next, yeah. Checking stability. All right, ratios get strange when the numbers are small. So I might say that if my privatized data has a value of 4 and my ground truth data has a value of 3, that I am only off by 1 and I'm doing pretty well. But if your metric has buried in it multiplicative checks, like the pie chart one does when the pie chart does normalization, that means that a difference of 1 on small values can have an outsized impact. So on a large data, I get a very nice score, and on small data, I get a much poorer score. Problems with stability can show up in your data, especially small data, especially dense data. If you have a randomized metric, you want to know how many times the metric has to be run in order to produce a reliable sort of range of scores. Your metric does not need to run well everywhere. It doesn't always need to be stable, but we want to know what are the conditions for getting a stable output from it. Okay, next slide. So otherwise you have the problem if somebody uses it and it says, my privatizer is fantastic. It's doing much better than this other guy's privatizer. It turns out that's not true because of metric instability. Okay, checking comparability. So this is the other one. How much of your metrics output is dependent on the structure and the schema of the data? Is the schema of the data independent of the data quality itself? So this is a worthwhile thing to check. If the number of the pie slices, so remember I said that Pie chart metric is great on the sort of event type data that we're doing, but if we wanted to do it on incomes, we would need to bin income. Otherwise, we'd have 100,000 possible pie slices, and our slices would be very thin. So when the schema for on the pie chart metric, when it's working with a schema that has too many possible record types, all of a sudden it doesn't perform well. It's going to tend to perform worse the more record types there are. So this is a question of, can I run your metric on my data set A and schema A and on schema B and say, okay, I got a 700 on schema A and I got a 600 on schema B. Can I say that A is actually doing better than B? Or is it just a matter of the metric itself is going to tend to give lower scores, and I can't compare on the metric between schemas? I can only use the metric to compare on a single schema and different data sets and privatizers on that one schema. This is important to know. And your metric may or may not have comparability between different schemas, but understanding those properties is important. Okay, next slide. All right, so that was all of the tips and tricks. We are nearly at completion. So what I'm going to do just here at the end is give you just a quick tour of the website. So HeroX, this is your main page right here. And next slide. There's your timeline. Don't forget, that says November 6th, but it should say November 30th. November 30th is when your executive summaries are due for optional preliminary review, and that's going to be updated after this talk. But this is where you go to check important dates if you've forgotten them. Next slide. Here's where you go to ask questions if you have them. So you go over to the forum. It's an ordinary forum. You can make new topics. You can ask questions under the existing topics. We would love to hear from you. And if you go to updates, there will be more announcements on what's going on with the challenge. Next slide. Resources, like I showed you back at the beginning, and there is your sample submission pie chart metric, so you can read through all of the things I glossed over about that sample submission, and your submission template that will give you the sections you need to fill out on your submission. Next slide. And that's it. We got the date correct on this one, so executive summary is due on November 30th. Next slide. Questions. So if we have anybody who wants to type a question into chat, please feel free to. We'll give you a couple minutes here to do that. Otherwise, please feel free to go ahead and ask questions over on the forum. And we will be happy to answer them completely and clearly and promptly. Especially if you're watching this video after the webinar, if you're watching the recording, just come ask us questions on that forum. All right. Next slide while we're doing this. Here are your websites.
Yes, excellent. So if any of our attendees would like to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the questions function. Otherwise, you can get a hold of us on the challenge website, or you can also email us at psprizes@nist.gov.
Okay.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions come through on the chat, so I will just have a pause, and then we can wrap up for the day. So thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you, Gary.
All right.
I think we do have some prepared questions that we can just go ahead and make a little FAQ over on the forum. So.
Sounds good. All right, so with that, then I will conclude today's webinar and thank everyone for attending. All right, thank you very much.